Imagine yourself a slave in Africa. Maybe you're a war criminal, captive, debt, something that's making them enslave you. But you know, one day, eventually the work will end. Eventually you'll get to see your family again, right? But one day, your captives take you to these people you ain't never seen before. Palm colored, skin turns red, string like hair, clothes you ain't never seen before, but they seem nice. And your captives tell you once this work is done, you can come back home and all will be forgiven. You just have to get this done. Right. You get on the boat. Everything seems smooth. But all of a sudden, you sense the energy change. They start throwing people off boats, hitting people, taking the woman. Something changed, something demonic. You don't know what it is. All while doing this, they're grinning, smiling even. They enjoy what they're doing. They lead you to the bottom of their boat. Cramped up, dark, it's hot. They put you in these little compartments. No space to even move your body. All while doing this palm colored man has the biggest grin on his face. You're wondering, why is he doing this? What does he get out of this? If only if you knew, it's the worst has yet to come. When people hear of the history of slavery in America, the story often begins with Africans already in chains, but that's not where American history begins. Long before the Atlantic slave trade, African societies had their own kingdoms, cities, economics, religions, political systems, trade networks, scholars, farmers, you name it. But beginning in the late 15th century, the Atlantic slave trade connected European merchants and African political and commercial networks, and the expanding American colonies in the system that forcibly transported millions of Africans across the sea. Today, we're going to look at both sides of history. First, what was Africa really like before the Atlantic slave trade became dominant? Then, what happened to enslaved Africans who were forced on ships and sent to the Atlantic? And finally, we'll examine the documented violence aboard those ships, including physical punishment, confinement, disease, sexual assault, resistance, and cases where enslaved people were just killed for no reason. We're going to focus on evidence because this isn't mythology. We have evidence, ship diagrams, court records, ship logs, first-hand accounts, physical artifacts. So let's start before the ships. The first thing we have to understand is that Africa was never just one civilization. Africa was enormous. Different people spoke different languages, practiced different religions, organized their own governments differently, and lived in completely different environments. There were farmers in the savannas, fishing communities, desert traders, coastal merchants, kingdoms, empires, city-states, decentralized communities, governed through families, elders, and councils. West Africa alone contained hundreds of languages, even numerous distinct societies. So when we say Africa before slavery, we're really talking about a huge variety of cultures, not just one civilization. Several major states that developed in West Africa, the Ghana Empire, then the Mali, then the Songhai. There were also Yoruba states, Benin, Karambu, and numerous Akan states. Further south and east, you have the Kingdom of Kongu, Ethiopia, Songhali, and the Great Zimbabwe. These weren't built all the same. They demonstrated something important. African political organization existed on a very large scale. Long before European colonial rule, the Mali Empire, for example, controlled enormous territories, grew wealthy by controlling trade routes, gold, producing regions, maintained armies, administered territories, and even supported major cities. One of the most important economic systems in West Africa history was the Trans-Saharan trade. The Sahara simply wasn't just a border. Merchants crossed it using organized routes. Gold from West Africa was extremely valuable. Salt was equally as valuable, and it was important for diet and food preservation. So merchants moved gold, salt, textiles, metal, horses, numerous distance, enormous even. The Timbuktu became one of the major commercial centers connected to all these networks. The Library of Congress describes Timbuktu as a significant commercial, cultural, and even religious center for more than 6 centuries, positioned at the critical in the Trans-Saharan trading system. The Library of Congress described the Timbuktu as a significant commercial, cultural, and religious center for more than 6 centuries, positioned at the critical point in the Trans-Saharan trading system. African economies weren't just isolated from the rest of the world. They were connected to North Africa, the Mediterranean, the Middle East, and wider international trade networks. Timbuktu is one of the best examples. Today, people sometimes use that name to mean somewhere incredibly far away. Historically, it was the opposite of insignificant. It was a major commercial and intellectual center. Merchants traveled there for trade. Scholars traveled there for education. Books were written and copied there. And scholars studied Islamic law, theology, astronomy, medicine, mathematics, you name it. The Library of Congress preserves manuscripts from Timbuktu dating back centuries, some discussing astronomy, inheritance law, agriculture, commerce, and contracts. It was not just broken Africa, you know what I mean. But one manuscript is actually a commercial agreement concerning the sale of transportation of the slave people between the Timbuktu and the Ghanese. Africa had a sophisticated intellectual and commercial traditions, but forms of slavery also existed in some African societies before the Atlantic slave trade. But it wasn't what you think. For the majority of people, agriculture was the foundation of life. People grew crops suited to their environment: millet, sorghum, rice, yams, plantains, and many others. People raised cattle like goats and sheep. Fishing was super important near the rivers and the coast. Families and extended kinship networks were central to most of society. Children learned skills from parents, relatives, elders, and specialists: farming, fishing, textile production, and metalworking. In societies with formerly scholarly traditions, some people received advanced education. History was incredibly important also. Specialists such as griots preserved genealogies, historical traditions, and political memories across generations. Knowledge was transmitted through families and apprenticeships and religious institutions and oral. Religion across Africa was incredibly diverse. There was no single just African religion. Some traditions recognized a supreme creator. Some involved numerous divine beings. Many gave important roles to their ancestors or spiritually significant natural locations or objects. Religion could influence politics, agriculture, family life, and medicine. Also kinship. For example, Yoruba religious traditions develop a complex system involving Olaudah and various Orosha. It just goes to show Africa contained hundreds of different religious systems. It wasn't just clumped together. Now we need to discuss something that often gets distorted and mistranslated. Slavery existed in various parts of Africa before Europeans even established the Atlantic slave trade. People could become enslaved through warfare, debt, punishment, and other circumstances. But African systems of slavery, they were diverse. They weren't identical to the chattel slavery that developed in the Americas. In some societies, enslaved people could become incorporated into households or communities. They were still viewed as people. Their status could vary depending on the society, and none of this means that slavery was just harmless. It involved the loss of freedom and could involve violence and exploitation, but historians have to distinguish between these systems, between the Atlantic slave trade system and just Africa itself. Now, this is where everything changes. European colonies in the Americas developed enormous demand for forced labor. Plantations producing sugar, tobacco, rice, and other commodities required huge amounts of labor. European merchants therefore entered the expanding trade in enslaved Africans. African captives were brought to the coastal trading centers and were sold by European traders. Then they were placed aboard ships. The Smithsonian describes the Atlantic slave trade as the largest forced migration of people by sea in history. And this is where the story becomes extremely dark. Imagine being taken from your home. You may not speak the language of people around you. You don't know where you're going. You've already been separated from your family and your community. Then you arrive at the coast and see something you ain't never encountered before: an enormous wooden ship sitting in the middle of the ocean. Olaudah Equiano described his experience of being brought onto a slave ship as an 11-year-old child. His account describes being examined by crew members, seeing numerous Africans chained together, and experiencing overwhelming fear. The National Park Service preserves his testimony as one of the most important first-hand accounts of the Middle Passage. Scholarship has questioned some of the details of Equiano's claimed birthplace and therefore whether every part of his account should be taken seriously. So we should count carefully and not just dismiss it, and not just pretend like historians have no questions about it. Now, once aboard, many captives were confined below deck. The conditions were extraordinarily cramped. The famous Brookes slave ship diagram, created in 1788, uses measurements of a Liverpool slave ship. It gives us physical evidence of how people were arranged. The diagram depicts around 450 people, but the Brookes had carried 609 enslaved people on a voyage in 1786. Once aboard, many captives were confined below deck. The conditions were extraordinarily cramped. The famous Brookes slave ship diagram, created in 1788, uses measurements of a Liverpool slave ship and gives us physical evidence of how people were arranged. The diagram depicts around 450 people, but the Brookes had carried 609 enslaved people on a voyage in 1786. Think about that. The diagram is important because it isn't simply an artist imagining what slavery just looked like. It was based on measurements of an actual ship that actually used evidence of the British abolitionist campaign. Imagine. They got the ship. They diagrammed 400 people could fit in it. They didn't have no regard for these people's lives. They knew what they were doing, but they just didn't care. Now, captives could be shackled, particularly during portions of the voyage. Men were often restrained together in groups. Their restraints made movement difficult, and the confinement itself created enormous problems. People couldn't simply walk away from someone who was sick. They couldn't even freely move around. They couldn't even leave the ship. And they couldn't even escape the people controlling them. The Smithsonian's collections preserve physical objects associated with the slave trade, including restraints. So we have written evidence and both physical evidence. Now, the way these people would treat these slaves like they're subhuman, not even human, just objects, just because the color of their skin was vile. Slaves would repeatedly receive whippings, be thrown off ships. The women would be raped. They would be literally put away from the men just to be raped and used. Imagine that was your sister, mother, aunt, and you can't do nothing about it. It was disgusting. Although there's no concrete evidence that's showing the women were getting sexually assaulted, historians have examined ships, documents, really showing that it did happen, even though we don't have physical evidence. They wouldn't even give you the satisfaction of death. Even if you were trying to starve yourself, there was a special machine they would put in your mouth that will crank your mouth open, so they will force food in your mouth. Even with the dumpage of slaves were dumped in massive packs. In 1781, which is one of the most famous examples, the Zong, when over 100 slaves were just dumped with no regard for their lives or anything. 100 human beings just dumped in the ocean. It was disgusting. They were dumping so much slaves in this water that literally sharks and animals were changing their routes just to get the dead slave bodies. It's horrible. And everybody always asks me, did certain slaves resist? Was there resistance movements? They tried and they tried. They weren't just sitting there and taking it. But if you're just chained up, no resources, you're eventually not going to go anywhere. They completely isolated these people, completely disrespected them, completely just treated them like dirt. But this is history, and you need to learn this history. It looks like you survived the trip. Hundreds of your family members, brothers, sisters, friends, just dead. But you survived. Why you? They take you off the ship, but it's only the beginning. All right, okay, guys, that's gonna be the end for that video right now. You know what I mean? I know I've been taking out the video slow, bro. Work with me, literally. I'm trying to learn how to edit while doing this video shit and all this. Yeah, it's just a lot, you know what I mean? But I do appreciate all the support, especially on TikTok, Instagram. I love y'all so much. I really want to like make sure I do this like once a week. I want to make sure I get videos out like once a week, give y'all parts, you know what I mean? This was just really just the origin, how the slave ships were. We're definitely gonna get more into it. I love y'all, bro. Y'all stay educated, bro. Knowledge is power, and y'all stay safe.
So I came up, they keep on calling me. With this rap shit, I give it all of me. All of my orders, they gon' toss for me. Nigga, you broke, you ain't no boss to me. Since I came up, they keep on calling me.